So in my last video, I talked about what needed to happen for me to be able to escape alcohol addiction for good. If you haven't seen that video already, you'll find a link to it in the description below. There I described how my obsession with alcohol started because alcohol provided me with certain things that I desperately needed. It allowed me to be at ease with myself and other people. It gave life this magical quality and allowed me to be free from worry. Today, I want to focus on this freedom from worry and how I eventually was able to get this using insight practices. Even as a young kid, I was a bit of a worrier, where things got a lot worse in my teenage years. Life would seem impossibly difficult at times, and I would regularly feel overwhelmed by things. The world appeared like a very scary place to me then, and the thing I loved about alcohol is it would provide a temporary escape from all this. Of course, it wasn't that alcohol actually changed the outside world. It only changed the way I perceived the outside world. When I drank, the world seemed like a much nicer place, but all that had changed was the way I was looking at things. It took me years to figure it out, but that means that the problem wasn't the world, but the way, as I say, I was seeing the world. And the way I was seeing the world was very much controlled by my usual way of thinking. My usual way of seeing things included ideas like that life wasn't how it should be. I also couldn't stop worrying about the future. And also, my habitual thinking, there was so much negativity towards myself, other people, and the world in general. So once I was able to clearly see that the problem wasn't so much life, but my way of looking at life, which was being determined by my usual way of thinking about things, I could then see that the answer lay somewhere with the thinking. Ultimately, I was able to realize that I just didn't see how unreliable my thoughts were. I also didn't understand my relationship to thinking. And most of all, I didn't even know there was an alternative to obsessive thinking. I remember when I was young, people would say to me, "You think too much." And I would be going, "What the hell are you talking about?" I thought if you weren't kind of thinking all the time, you'd basically drop dead or something. The thing that eventually worked for me in regards to dealing with thinking was insight practices. And I'm going to be kind of spending most of the rest of the video talking about these. My favorite definition of insight is by a teacher called Rob Orbia. He defines insight as seeing that frees. Insight practices generally use what's called mindfulness as a tool for seeing things more clearly. I like to describe mindfulness as knowing what the mind is doing. For example, if I'm meditating and I start getting distracted, I can notice that I've become distracted. I can become mindful that I've become distracted. This ability to notice what the mind is doing can be incredibly useful because it means that we can get to know the mind in a way that leads to insight. We can also use this ability to know what the mind is doing to maintain certain states such as friendliness. And we'll talk more about that in the next video. For now, we're going to focus on using mindfulness as a way to gain insight. As I said before, in order for me to escape the clutches of obsessive thinking, certain things needed to happen. I need to see things more clearly. In Buddhism, they talk about three particular insights known as the three characteristics. And it turned out that these were exactly what I needed to be able to overcome obsessive thinking. And those three insights are insight into impermanence, insight into non-self, and insight into the nature of suffering. One of the things that we start to notice in meditation when we become still enough to see this is that our attention is constantly moving from one thing to the next, sometimes to a sound, to a smell, to a taste, to some kind of physical sensation or some kind of visual sensation. And each of these is completely unique. So each sound is completely unique in a way. We're never going to perceive that sound in the exact same way again. But then we also have thinking. And thinking is kind of creating a story to help us make sense of that experience of all of those different kind of inputs. Problems arise when we start to really prioritize thinking. or our mind starts prioritizing thinking, what happens then is that rather than this kind of rich, ever-changing experience, what we find is we're kind of caught in this very, very limited story of what's going on that's lacking so much. Another important thing we notice as we observe impermanence is that when our attention is on something, it kind of has this sense of importance. But when our attention moves on to something else, that something else gains that sense of importance. And what that means is, like, so say something like a negative thought or an addiction craving, that when they're there in front of us, they can seem very, very important. But if we just wait, we don't have to do anything to get rid of that craving. It will just pass along. And as soon as it kind of passes along, as soon as your attention moves on to something else, that craving or that negative thought loses its importance. It loses its hold over us. So we never need to do anything to get rid of it. It's going anyway. The next important insight is insight into non-self. And part of this is this kind of recognition that rather than choosing the thinking, actively, consciously choosing the thinking, it's actually more like the thoughts are just kind of appearing to us within consciousness, that they're just kind of coming by themselves. And this is very important because it's actually the sense that we're choosing the thoughts that gives them so much power over us. One of the things that happens where I teach, often with new people, many of them will never have meditated before. And so I'll ask them, how was your first meditation session? And a response I get commonly enough is someone will say, oh, it was terrible. Like I spent the whole time thinking about how awful my life is. And I will say to them, why did you decide to think about that? And they will often say, well, I didn't. And that's the point. But it's the sense that we are choosing the thinking that gives us so much priority over us. Insight into the nature of suffering arose as I started to notice that those times when I saw the thinking as just these impermanent objects coming and going, and when I wasn't treating those objects as if I'd chosen them, that when that happened, I wasn't suffering. And that my suffering arose because when I was treating what was impermanent as permanent, and when I was treating what was non-self as in something I was not choosing, as if I was choosing. There are many techniques for gaining insight, but they all basically boil down to getting into a position where you can more clearly see, be more mindful of what's going on with your mind, and to just kind of be aware, like get yourself still enough that you can be aware of your attention moving from one thing to the next. Be aware that that's kind of happening by itself. And also notice that when you're just watching, when you're just allowing things to just this ever changing stream to continue without identifying with it, without treating it as self, there is no suffering. Insight into impermanence helped me start to see how unreliable my thoughts were when it came to actually describing reality. I also started to understand my relationship with thinking a lot better, in that I wasn't actually choosing the thinking, so it wasn't as important as I previously thought. And also I started to experience this different way of being in the world that didn't require obsessive thinking. Eventually I reached a point with the insight practices where I kind of recognized that I was no longer a victim to this kind of obsessive worry. Something profound had changed. And for a few years, it really felt to me that this was, this was as good as it gets for me, that I found this, peace that I never would have believed possible. But I started to have this kind of niggle at the back of my head that there was still kind of more to do, still more to find. And it was these kind of further practices that I'm going to talk about in the next two videos, about developing the metta, or the friendliness, and the imaginal practices, that finally brought me to this kind of more solid state of well being, which was really what I needed.